In this module, we'll teach you how to search SharePoint content with a connector built by Google. The connector feeds content to the appliance for indexing and checks user permissions at serve time for each result. There's a companion module to this tutorial that walks through a sample configuration, and the concepts are covered here. In this module, you will learn how to investigate your SharePoint architecture for content and security, identify configuration options, and configure the most likely scenarios. To configure the connector, you'll need to identify the following: how much content to crawl, how many connectors and connector instances to deploy, and which authentication and authorization methods to use. To begin, SharePoint is a collaboration suite for managing and sharing content on the web as shown here. Your root SharePoint administrator creates web applications for users groups, specifying each application URL, administrator, and authentication method. Then, application administrators define the following: the web pages of the app, the types of content to manage such as documents and metadata, and the users and groups with permissions to content. The connector finds and feeds web pages, documents, and metadata to the appliance for indexing at crawl time and honors user authentication and authorization at serve time. It also provides a Google search box that can be embedded in SharePoint applications so users can run appliance-based searches inside SharePoint. At a high level, SharePoint is structured as a collection of servers called a farm. Users and groups are managed in Active Directory with typically one Active Directory per farm. If you have more than one AD, you may have more than one farm. Within a farm, applications are hosted and crawlable as IIS sites on servers called web front ends. Since web applications are deployed as IIS sites, .NET security applies. This means that each site can have its own method of authenticating users, such as Kerberos or NTLM. Within each application, you have one default site collection and may have additional subsites for managing your content. To crawl and serve content, you need to know your application's site URL, site collections, and subsites, and the authentication method. The list of web applications managed in a SharePoint farm can be found as shown here within SharePoint's Central Console under Application Management, Web Application List. From there you can see a list of applications with their site URLs including port numbers. In this case, there are 5 web applications in addition to the search box and Central Console applications. Once you select an application to work with, you can see the list of site collections and the primary site administrator for this application. For example, this application is hosted on the Shanghai server, port 4001. It has only one default site collection, no subsites, and its primary site administrator is AD/SharePoint-admin. Now let's talk about the connector. The connector can be deployed either on the appliance or on a separate server. The onboard version is for easy setup and can be useful for proof of concepts or POCs. However, it does not scale beyond 500,000 documents and may not perform well under heavy query load. More likely, you'll need to use the off-board connector in production. It scales beyond 500,000 documents and handles high query load. However, you have to install it on a separate server. It deploys in seconds and can be installed on Windows or Linux, and you can deploy more than one connector to distribute your load. There's also a resource kit that you will likely need to install on your web front-end servers. It's needed to support crawling more than one site, NTLM authentication, connector authorization, and the Google search box. Note, you'll need to get the SharePoint administrator's permission to install the resource kit. They may not want to install something on their SharePoint servers, so explain to them that this may be needed and that it is installed as a SharePoint template, not a web part. Each farm requires its own connector, and you may need multiple connectors to improve crawl or serve performance. You can deploy multiple connectors and distribute them to different servers to gain efficiency. In addition, you deploy one or more connector instances in a given connector. Each connector instance sends its own feed to the appliance. The appliance's feeder gate is multi-threaded, so it can handle multiple feeds. In addition, you can configure each connector instance's crawl schedule and feed rate. A number of factors impact crawl performance, including large numbers of site collections and documents, deep hierarchies of sites and subsites, your network traffic, and your load on your SharePoint servers for other processes. A number of factors impact serving performance, including number of concurrent users and complexity of search requests, especially when using dynamic navigation. Serving issues usually involve large numbers of authorization checks that can be remedied using preloaded ACLs in the index instead of back-end API requests to the SharePoint servers. We'll discuss this in more detail shortly. There are no hard and fast rules, so it's best to test some crawling and serving early on to decide how many connectors and connector instances you may need. You can download the offboard connector and resource kit from the following URL. The connector can be installed on Windows or Linux, and the resource kit can be installed on 32 or 64-bit SharePoint web front-end servers. Check the documentation for IIS and .NET versions needed to support the resource kit. This is what the offboard connector installer looks like when you run it on Windows. It deploys as a Tomcat application within a Tomcat server, running on the port that you specify. The Tomcat server starts running as a Windows service under the name that you specify here and connects to your GSA. There, it adds a connector in which you can add connector instances. To use multiple connectors, run the offboard connector installer multiple times on one or more servers, specifying your appliance IP address. If you run it on the same server, make sure to use different ports and service names so you don't have conflicts. Here are screenshots from the appliance's admin console showing installed connectors on the left and a connector instance configuration page on the right. Note admin console refers to connectors as connector managers and connector instances as connectors. In this example, there are two connectors, one called Connector Manager 0, which is the pre-installed onboard connector, and the other called SharePoint 1, which is the offboard connector that we just installed. You must add at least one connector instance per connector to make it active. When you configure an instance, you can control and distribute load based on the URL patterns and scheduling parameters, which are not shown here. If you want to add multiple instances per connector, add them here. We'll discuss connector instance configuration in more detail shortly. What we've seen so far is how to install the offboard connector and view it in the admin console. Now let's look at how to deploy the resource kit. The installer runs as an MSI installer once on each web front end containing sites you want to use. You can choose a full install or just the services you need. Most likely you'll need the Google SharePoint services, which supports multiple sites and connector authorization requests instead of ACLs. If you perform a full install, the installer will also add the SAML bridge for NTLM authentication and the Google search box. You will need to specify a port number for the SAML bridge whether you choose to install it or not, a test site URL, and a service user that can read the test site. The installer will do the following. It'll report connection success or failure to the test site. It will install the SAML bridge as an IIS server and service if you choose to do it, and the Google SharePoint services will be added as a template to the web front end so the connector can crawl multiple sites and ready itself to receive connector authorization requests. Now let's look at user authentication and what's supported. Authentication occurs once per session when users run secure searches. The most common forms of SharePoint authentication are Kerberos and NTLM that happen silently behind the scenes with the browser and without the user's prompt. Kerberos is more secure than NTLM and is easier to configure on the GSA. Since silent authentication is so important to good user experiences, we will only discuss Kerberos and NTLM here. The connector also supports LDAP and HTTP basic authentication with a prompt that can be used if needed, but not forms or claims-based authentication. Which authentication method you use depends on the following: which authentication method SharePoint uses, where users come from, for example, the local intranet, a VPN, or the open internet, and which devices users use, for example, Windows, Mac, or iPhone. Kerberos is supported only on local intranets, not over VPNs or through firewalls. Furthermore, it is only supported on Windows and Linux-based OSs, and IE, Firefox, and Safari-based browsers. Let's return to SharePoint Central Console to find out which authentication method or provider is used on your web applications. Once you select an application, you click Authentication Provider. Each application can have different authentication providers based on where users come from, for example, the local intranet, an extranet or VPN, or the general internet. This is specified using Microsoft Zones. Most likely, you will only have one security zone per application, and it will be the default zone. As shown here, this application has only one zone, and it's the default zone, and on that zone it uses integrated Windows authentication, which can be either Kerberos or NTLM. In this case, it's NTLM. We'll talk about Kerberos first because it's the preferred method to use. Kerberos is sophisticated and has some subtleties, so we only discuss a high-level overview of it here. You'll want to review our Kerberos training or documentation for details and make sure that it is working correctly in your environment before setting it up with a connector. The easiest way to set up Kerberos is to create and import a key tab file into the appliance. If your Kerberos administrator will let you do this, then this is the recommended authentication approach. If you cannot install a key tab file on the search appliance due to security policies, you can still use Kerberos authentication, but you will need to use the SAML bridge, which we will discuss shortly. You can also use Kerberos authentication in lieu of NTLM if your security administrator will let you do it. If so, then all you do is configure Kerberos on the appliance and on your user's browsers. This will save you from having to install the SAML bridge to support NTLM. To configure Kerberos on the appliance, you first create a service principal user account and key tab file for the search appliance on your Active Directory server. Then, you go to Serving Authentication Mechanisms, and on the Kerberos tab as shown here, you specify your Active Directory server, import the key tab file, and enable Kerberos authentication. If you cannot switch from NTLM to Kerberos or cannot use a key tab file for Kerberos, you need to use the SAML bridge for unprompted authentication. SAML bridge installs on another server as an IIS service running in an IIS server. You can install it separately or as part of the resource kit. For instructions on how to deploy the SAML bridge, consult the SAML bridge documentation. The appliance uses the SAML bridge to get a user's Kerberos ticket or NTLM token from the user's browser and authenticate the user with Active Directory silently, and return the user's ID to the appliance. The appliance simply could not do this on its own under these circumstances. If you use the SAML bridge, you will use one of the following authorization methods: ACLs when using NTLM and no Google search box, connector authorization when using NTLM and the search box, or connector authorization or ACLs with Kerberos and no key tab file. Authorization is the process of checking a user's permission to each result before returning results to users. We have two choices for authorization: early binding using ACLs that are fetched from SharePoint and preloaded into the appliance's index at crawl time, or late binding using authorization requests from the connector to the backend SharePoint server at serve time. ACLs allow the appliance to check permissions in microseconds and is highly desirable because queries do not slow down or time out. Connector authorization requests can take hundreds of milliseconds and is not as desirable as queries may slow down or time out and only return partial results. However, ACLs are relatively new to the connector, and there are some caveats. They do not expand standard AD groups like domain users or support multiple AD servers. If you're using these features, you will want to use connector authorization for now. ACL support is being updated frequently, so check for new releases and updates. To configure authorization, you may need to specify options in two places: on the connector configuration page and on the connector authentication tab under Serving Authentication Mechanisms. In the connector configuration page, shown on the top right, you select Authorization by Connector. If you use connector authorization instead of ACLs, this is all you do. If you use ACLs, you also need to set the following on the connector configuration page: Authorization by ACLs, and your LDAP settings to perform AD group lookups, which is not shown here. If you use local SharePoint groups, you also need to select username and group formats on the connector configuration page and perform group lookup only on the connector authentication tab shown on the bottom. Remember, connector authorization also requires the resource kit. So far, we've seen how to install the connector and resource kit and configure authentication and authorization. Now let's take a look at configuring the connector instance and the crawl patterns to include. Currently, ACLs and connector authorization require a content feed. This is a requirement that will go away soon, but for now it remains. In the GSA's follow and crawl pattern, a content feed is designated using the specially reserved expression *Google connector : and no crawler access. In the connector configuration page, we specify fully qualified domain name URLs to SharePoint content. SharePoint URLs are hierarchical in nature and can include such patterns as the default site collection with just the host and port, all site collections with the word sites added to the host and port, a specific site collection with the site name appended, or a specific list of objects by specifying the library name as well. Remember, these are URL patterns that can include regular expressions or only portions of paths. So for example, you could limit content to specific file types or only libraries containing, for example, the word books in the name. You can also specify the MySites collection, which may be on a different server or application. Be sure to ask your SharePoint administrator where the MySites is located. On the connector configuration page, you specify the following: a crawl URL for one application including server, port, and optionally site-specific information, credentials for the service or interface user account used to crawl content, URL patterns to all sites that you want to include, an additional MySites URL if needed, and URLs that you do not want to include. There will be a number of overhead URLs returned by the connector that you do not want to include. They will not refer to any useful content, but may be required to be crawled to crawl all site pages and find content. They will quickly consume your license. Check for them after some initial crawling, and then add patterns for them to the Do Not Crawl patterns on the appliance's crawl and index page, but do not add them here. Continuing down the page, if you use alternate access mapping in SharePoint to expose internal URLs as more readable or secure external URLs for users, specify them in the site's alias mappings here. You can also specify whether to honor SharePoint visibility options, which determine whether crawlers can crawl and index content, and whether to include unpublished content. Alternate access mappings can be found in SharePoint's Central Console under Operations, Alternate Access Mapping as shown here. Each security zone may have its own URL, so users coming from the internet, for example, can view different links than, say, intranet users. To configure the rest of the connector, specify the following: authorization by connector as discussed earlier, and if using ACLs instead of connector Authz, also specify authorization by ACLs, user and group name formats if you have multiple LDAP domains or are using both LDAP and local SharePoint groups, which is likely, LDAP group lookups, and user and group cache sizes and refresh rates for optimal performance with your backend servers. You can also specify advanced settings, which are not shown here, to control such things as the metadata fields that you want to include or exclude. That's it for the configuration. Here are the things to check when troubleshooting. The feed files and log files are especially useful. Check the list of feeds sent to the appliance with possible errors and downloaded feed files listing all URLs, ACLs, metadata, and content sent to the appliance. This is available under Admin Console in the Crawl and Index Feeds page, which is shown below. You can also check crawl diagnostics to verify what is indexed. You can also check the Security Manager logs that show which users are authenticated and whether the appliance has the correct username and which content is being authorized and how it was authorized, for example by connector or ACL, and if the groups were resolved correctly. You can also check the connector logs, which are available from Connector Administration, Connector Managers, and can show how Connector Authz is resolving and whether group lookups are correct if you're using the connector for authorization. Just as a note, there are three types of ACLs sent to the appliance: the User Access Control Lists, the SharePoint Local Groups, and the LDAP Groups. The groups are used for resolution lookup at serve time. Here's how they appear in feeds and crawl diagnostics. Note, the deny ACLs can be defined at the web application level in SharePoint. If you have these, you will need to add them as policy ACLs in the Admin Console or using the Policy ACL API, as they are not currently provided automatically. See documentation for details. In this module, you learned how to investigate your SharePoint architecture for content to crawl and security to honor, identify configuration requirements and options, and configure the most likely scenarios. Be sure to view the companion module to this tutorial that demonstrates a walkthrough of a sample configuration.